She was born into silence. No doctor announced her first cry, no proud father held her up to the light, and no family gathered to celebrate. Instead, her birth was hidden in shadows, as if the world itself recoiled from what it had just witnessed. The girl who entered this world was not only unwanted, she was a living reminder of a secret too horrific to confess. Her mother was also her grandmother, and her father was her own brother in blood. She was the child of a union between mother and son, and her face carried the weight of generations of silence. This was not an accident. It was the consequence of a family that turned inward, collapsing in on itself until bloodlines blurred and shame was inherited like property. What do you see when you look into the eyes of a child like this? Some say innocence, others see tragedy, but those who lived closest to her said it was something deeper, a vacant stare, as though she had been born already exhausted, already marked by the sins of those who created her. Her features were unmistakable, too symmetrical in places, distorted in others. Her jaw underdeveloped, her eyes slightly crossed, her speech never fully forming. And yet she was still a child. She laughed, she cried, she tried to run, but every movement of her fragile body reminded the people around her that she should not have existed. The town whispered, not loudly, never in daylight. In the corners of shops, in hushed voices at church, people told each other what they had seen. They said her very presence carried a curse, that she was not a child of God, but of sin, and yet no one intervened. No one spoke directly to the family. They let the house on the hill rot in silence, with its curtains drawn and its secrets sealed. Because what happened inside was not simply scandal, it was something the human mind recoils from, something that makes even the most judgmental her ears go still. And so she lived, a ghost in plain sight. The girl whose existence could not be explained without unraveling everything. The girl who, in her very blood, carried the collapse of a family, and the question that lingered over her life was never why she was born, but how long she could survive. Her story does not begin with her, it begins with the house, a decaying structure on the outskirts of a small American town where isolation was not a punishment, but a way of life. Families like this one did not mingle, did not invite neighbors in, did not celebrate holidays in public squares. They kept to themselves, and the world allowed them to. Behind those weather-beaten walls, a cycle of dependence grew unchecked. A mother who had lost her husband early, clinging too tightly to the only child she had left. A son who never learned the ways of men outside his bloodline, trapped between loyalty and need. Over time, the boundaries that should have protected them, boundaries of family, of morality, of survival itself, eroded until nothing remained but the impulse to reach for the closest body in the dark. For most families, history is a lineage of names. For this one, it was a lineage of secrets. The son grew into a man without ever leaving his mother's side. She aged, he did not marry, and the two became inseparable. People noticed, but only from a distance. The windows of that house were always covered, as though hiding the unnatural closeness within. And when she bore another child, years after her husband's death, the whispers grew louder. For who could explain how a woman well past her prime could suddenly become a mother again? That child was the girl who should not have existed. She was not simply the daughter of her mother, she was the daughter of her mother's son. A child born from the collision of two roles, where parenthood and partnership had fused into something unspeakable. It is difficult to describe what such a birth does to a human body, to the fragile architecture of genetics. The blood was too close, the ancestry too entangled. What emerges is not always whole, not always strong enough to carry the weight of survival, yet she lived, fragile but bretty, fragile but real. And with her existence came shame that spread like mold through the town. People averted their eyes when the boy, now a man, was seen walking with his mother, pretending she was only his parent. They refused to acknowledge the child he sometimes carried in his arms, as though by ignoring her they could erase the truth. But secrets do not vanish. They linger and they rot, and eventually they spill into the open. And in this family, the truth was not just a whisper, It was a living, breathing girl whose very body testified to the sin that created her. The girl grew, but never like the others. Childhood for her was not freedom. It was a cage built from stares, from avoidance, from the quiet cruelty of being seen as less than human. She was small, her limbs thin as branches, her features uneven in a way that made strangers uncomfortable to look at for too long. She struggled to speak, her words fractured, caught between her tongue and her brain like stones in a riverbed. The other children did not play with her. They mocked her in whispers or ran when she approached. Some were told by their parents not to touch her, as though misfortune could spread through skin. Inside the house, things were worse. She was loved, yes, but with a love poisoned by guilt. The mother who rocked her to sleep did so with trembling hands, knowing that the lullabies she sang were meant to cover the sound of what she had done. The father, her brother, never looked her fully in the eyes, as though to do so would mean acknowledging the enormity of his crime. And yet, there was tenderness there too. He carried her when she was weak, he fed her when she would not eat, but each act of care was stained with the unbearable truth that he was both her protector and her destroyer. The town's silence only deepened the wound. Neighbors avoided her family's land. Children grew into teenagers and adults who learned not to speak of the house on the edge of town. The girl became less a person and more a legend, a living rumor that parents used as a warning to their own children. Don't wander too far, don't ask too many questions, or you'll end up like her. She became the embodiment of a fear no one dared name aloud, the fear of what happens when bloodlines fold in on themselves, when human beings forget the invisible walls that hold society together. And yet, for all the shame, for all the suffering, there were moments when she smiled, when she sat in the grass, humming tunelessly. The sun caught her face and softened it. In those fleeting instants, she looked like any other child, someone who wanted to be held, to be seen, to be loved without judgment. But those moments never lasted. The weight of her origin was always there, pressing down, reminding everyone, including her, that her life was not a gift, but a sentence. As she grew older, her very body became a testimony. Doctors, when they finally laid eyes on her, spoke in low voices of what they saw. A spine curved unnaturally, a jaw that never quite aligned, eyes that could not focus together, and a mind that flickered between clarity and confusion. These were not random afflictions, they were signatures, carved into her by the intimacy of blood too close. In her DNA lay the echo of choices made in silence, choices that bent her bones and dimmed her mind before she ever took her first breath. But there was something more haunting than her physical frailty. It was her awareness. She knew she was different. She watched other children walk with ease, laugh without hesitation, and speak without stumbling, and in her own faltering way, she longed to join them. She asked questions her family could not answer, questions they feared more than any gossip from the town. Why did she look the way she did? Why did people turn away? Why did her father call her his daughter, when she sometimes overheard others whisper that he was also her brother? These questions, spoken in her soft and broken voice, carried the weight of a curse. Her mother grew older, worn down not only by the years, but by the shame that clung to her skin. The son, once hidden behind his mother's shadow, now had to face the reality of what he had created. He walked through the town carrying groceries, and though no one dared confront him, every set of eyes that turned toward him was filled with quiet accusation. He knew, he had always known, but the act was done, and the consequence of it breathed and suffered under his roof every single day. In time, the girl became less a daughter and more a mirror. Every smile she gave, every halting step she took, reflected back the sin that had brought her into the world. Her existence could not be denied, and that was the true horror. Because if she lived, then so too did the truth of what her family had done, and so her life became a burden not just to her own fragile body, but to the entire family that had tried to bury their secret beneath silence and distance. She was no longer just a child. She was the evidence. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because by now you understand this story is not only about one child, it is about what happens when silence feeds on itself. Families like hers do not appear overnight. They are born from generations of retreat, of walls built higher and higher until the world outside becomes too distant to touch. In that isolation, rules break down, morality bends, and love, which should nurture, becomes twisted into something unrecognizable. The town carried its share of guilt. Every person who looked away, every neighbor who chose silence over confrontation, became part of the story. They knew what was happening in that house. They saw the son, a grown man, living only with his mother, and they watched as another child appeared from nowhere. They whispered, but they never acted, because to acknowledge it openly would mean dragging into the light something so unnatural, so revolting, that it might stain them as well. So they let it fester, they let it rot, and the result was a little girl who bore the weight of everyone's silence. There is something haunting about the way shame spreads across generations. The girl, fragile as she was, had no voice in how she came to be. She did not choose her parents. She did not choose the curse written into her blood. Yet she was the one who carried the stares, the whispers, the burden of being seen as less than whole. She was punished for existing, while the ones who created her hid behind curtains and silence. And still, she clung to life. She reached out, she tried to smile, she tried to find some kind of normal in a world that refused to give it to her. There is a strange strength in that, an unspoken defiance. Perhaps that is why her story lingers even now, decades later, because it forces us to ask the question no one in her town wanted to face: what would we have done if the sea at the edge of town belonged to our neighbors? If we saw the signs, would we have knocked on that door? Or would we too have turned away and whispered in secret, waiting for someone braver to step forward? So tell me, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Time has a way of burying sins, but not erasing them. The girl grew into adolescence, though her body never fully kept pace. Her mind, too, seemed caught between childhood and something else, never quite maturing in the way others did. Yet, as she aged, the weight of the truth around her only grew heavier. She was no longer a child people could dismiss as different. She was a living reminder, a shadow that walked among them, proof that the line between mother and son had been crossed in secret. Her father, her brother, began to wither under the strain. Once, he had been a man who moved through town silently, carrying bags, never speaking more than necessary. But as the years wore on, his face seemed to sag under invisible burdens. He avoided the gaze of others, his shoulders hunched, his body a shell of someone who once believed he could keep his secret buried. For the mother, age stripped her of whatever strength she had once used to justify what she had done. She retreated deeper into the house, her curtains thicker, her presence nearly vanished from the town, and the girl, caught between them, became their prison. Rumors turned into stories, stories turned into myths. People spoke of the house of shame, of the girl who should not exist, of the bloodline that twisted itself into something monstrous. Some said she was cursed, others said she was punishment. But beneath the superstitions was a truth no one wanted to admit. This was not fate, not God's hand, but human choice. Choices made in silence, repeated until they became irreversible. By now, her health was failing. Each year left her weaker, her bones more fragile, her body less able to fight the simple illnesses that others survived without thought. Doctors who might have helped were never called, either out of pride, fear, or the desperate wish to keep the secret intact. And so the girl who had fought so hard to exist began to fade. Her story, like her life, became one of inevitability. And when she was gone, the town did not hold a funeral, not in any public sense. There were no hymns sung, no bells rung. Her passing was barely spoken of, as though her death was simply the closing of a chapter people had never dared to read aloud. But death does not silence truth, it only hardens it, and the silence around her life became louder than any words ever could. Her death should have ended the story, but in truth, it was only the beginning. Because once a secret like this slips through the cracks, it does not vanish. It lingers, festering in memory, growing heavier with time. The house where she lived, where she suffered, stood for years after her passing. Rot crept through its walls, glass shattered, the roof sagged. Some said you could still hear her voice if you stood close at night, a soft hum like the songs she once sang to herself in the grass. Whether it was memory or imagination, no one wanted to go near. The land seemed poisoned by the weight of what had been done there. But the legacy of such a story is not confined to one family or one town. It forces us to look at the darker side of human nature, the way isolation twists love into something unrecognizable, the way shame builds walls higher than any prison, the way silence becomes complicity. The girl was born into a nightmare not of her making, yet she is remembered only as its symbol, a face people did not want to look at, a life people did not want to acknowledge, a death people tried to forget. And yet, forgetting is impossible, because her story echoes far beyond that house, far beyond that town. It reminds us of what can happen when bloodlines turn inward, when the rules that protect us are ignored, when human beings convince themselves that secrecy can outlast consequence. It cannot. Secrets rot, they seep, they spread, and eventually they demand to be told. Today, her name is nearly lost, the details scattered in whispers, in half-remembered accounts, in records deliberately erased. But the truth remains, carved into the memory of those who knew, those who looked away, and those who inherited the shame without ever asking for it. She was not just a child of sin, she was a warning, a reminder of how fragile the boundary is between love and destruction, in family and curse. And now, by speaking her story aloud, we pull her from the shadows where she was buried, not to shame her, but to confront the silence that surrounded her, to acknowledge that she lived, that she suffered, that her very existence reveals a truth most would rather keep hidden. She was the most inbred girl ever born from mother and son, and her story will not stay buried.